and welcome to Cut Through, Crikey's spin-free analysis of Australian news, politics and power. I'm your host, Crystal Andrews, and today I am joined by Crikey's Associate Editor, Cam Wilson, for an update on how things are starting to go a little bit awry with the teen social media ban. Cam, welcome to Cut Through for the first time.
Hello, it is my deep pleasure to be here. I've been sitting on the sidelines waiting for the call up, and I'm so excited that it's my time.
We had to wait for the right moment to get you back onto the new pod. And this is the moment. This is the moment because you are the journalist, the guy covering the government's teen social media ban. I hope you don't mind me saying that, but it's true, even in my biased opinion. And it's quite interesting because it feels like we in the Crikey office have been talking about this and covering this for a really, really long time. But in reality, this concept, this idea is kind of like only 12 months old, really.
Yeah, I think it was early, like it was like Q2 of 2024 when Anthony Albanese first said that he was doing it. And it kind of came out of left field because he was asked about it, if I recall correctly, on a radio show, I believe by Whipper, who is one of the people who is behind one of the very pro social media ban groups, if he would do it. And he was like, yeah, like we'll figure out the details. But he was just like, we're going for it. And it's kind of been a roller coaster since then.
Yeah, Fitzy and Whipper on Nova, the
Thought
can we call them
leaders.
like the lobbyists formerly known as Whipper?
Yeah.
It really was sort of like thrust into the political discourse at that time, and then very quickly got bipartisan support. Labor introduced the legislation into Parliament, and it was passed really quickly. November 2024, the legislation was passed by both houses of Parliament. Ignoring the quite extensive, I think, criticism from, privacy experts, tech experts, child and psychology experts, civil groups, a lot of others. But this is where we're at right now. The laws, as they stand, will come into effect from December 2025. And that means that the relevant parties have spent pretty much the majority of this year trying to figure out how to actually implement this and how it all works in practice. So maybe, Cam, if you can give me kind of a snapshot to begin with of what the legislation that we have, what it actually demands and dictates of people on the internet.
The law, which passed in late 2024, is pretty bare bones. It creates the obligation for social media companies to do something. Specifically, the obligation is like reasonable steps, and that obligation is on the social media companies. So, it's not on parents, not on kids themselves, I guess. They have to self-regulate. But other than that, other than the fact that they were like, we will, you companies need to do something, a lot of the details were left up in the air. Part of those were going to be figured out by this policy process that's continued over 2025, where they've had to decide what are the companies that will be defined as social media companies, what are the companies and their platforms that will be excluded. And the second half of that will be what are the reasonable steps that these companies, now that they're included, need to take. That part, even yet, still hasn't been figured out, and we're now, I think, about 4 months until it comes into effect on December 10. But at the same time, these companies have had to essentially like start to figure out how to do this, because come, at the end of the year, regardless of whenever the government actually puts out its guidelines for what they expect, these companies need to actually have the technology up and running. And as part of that, the government has been running this trial to look at the technologies to tell them, hey, this is the stuff that we know that works, and these are the companies who are doing these services.
When you say technology, I guess what we're really talking about, and in a sense what this legislation is really about, is age verification, and that age verification to be done by age assurance tools. I think I've got the terminology
Yeah, I know.
on that, right?
There's so much lingo and it's so overlapping. So I mean, the thing that I've just been calling it now is age checking, because not to get too into the weeds, but age verification is this idea that you will essentially 100% verify someone's age. And that is already used for things like, if you can sign up for like neobanks or other services already that require you to actually comply often with know your customer obligations, that mean that you really need to prove your identity and your age. And so that almost entirely revolves around submitting government ID or credit cards or something like that. But then under the kind of umbrella of age checking, there's also age assurance, which is the kind of industry, I think, led lingo, which is this idea that we're not going to be 100% sure, but we're pretty sure of your age through things like everything from facial analysis to other biometric analysis, all the way down to even using things like the existing data they have on you to figure out your age to decide, are you, in Australia's case, older than 16? If so, you could have a social media account. If not, you may not have a social media account under the teen social media ban.
Yeah. I guess that really is, the crux of what this is about. Like that technology has to work to a degree. I think it is, quote, private, robust, and effective way of determining whether you fall into that above 16 or under 16 category. And so to make sure that, I guess, that the tech is viable, the government put together a trial guided by an advisory board of stakeholders, within the tech industry. You've been reporting on that pretty much for the most part of this year. Those trials have started to have some results come out, but it seems like things are maybe not going as well as had hoped.
Yeah, so this trial was commissioned by the government actually before the teen social media ban was even passed into law. I've been referring to it as the teen social media ban tech trial because it is looking at ways that these companies will be able to figure out how to enforce their under 16 ban. But it's also for the government's other plans that it has kind of, I don't know if I yet call it signaled, but I would say most people expect that the government will in probably, this is actually a little bit of potentially breaking news, probably in the next 2 weeks, introduce some measures that mean that not just social media companies, but websites that have explicit content like adult material, gambling, that kind of stuff, will also need to take measures to figure out people's age so it can stop people who are under the age that are supposed to be looking at the services. So the trial was it's kind of doing all of this. It's to say, there is this policy here that we're kind of looking at, but part of it is just we got to figure out how do we actually enforce any rule online of how to figure out people's age. And so they've been running it since last year. The tender was awarded towards the end of last year, and then since then until just a few days ago, the trial was running. The way that it worked is a group said, "Hey, anyone who has technologies who want to be tested in the Australian context, come to us. We will let you take part in a trial." 53 companies signed up for it, and then they have been tested. And I'm just going to put like an asterisk there in the air so we can kind of come back to that.
We'll come back to that.
Tested, yep. And so now this trial has results. They've looked at the results. They've come up with a report. They released some preliminary findings, which was just essentially like a press release saying we think that this is technologically viable. And then they then completed a report with all this data that they've given to government. Government has it right now, and we expect that they will publish that in the next couple of weeks. And the whole point is to say, this new area of technology, we don't really have a whole lot of good public data on how it works. The trial is supposed to say, here's all this data, let's use that to inform public debate. But also that, many of the tech companies and other companies who are now saying, well, we've got these obligations on us, or maybe even we want to be better at checking people's age to stop certain, minors from accessing whatever. And here's now some public data that can help you understand not only which technologies work, but which providers actually do what they say they can do.
Yeah. And there are a variety of different methods and tools that are being tested as part of this trial. Things like, I guess, facial recognition, a lot of people would be familiar with. And you wrote a piece about a company that was testing hand gestures or something like that. So there's a variety of different tools and methods that are being tested. Have we seen or heard about any preliminary results, and how has that looked so far?
So there have been no public results from the trial yet. there was kind of a snippet that ABC reported on saying that facial recognition had, I think, got within a couple of years of people's age, like years of people's age, like 85% of the time. And then I got my hands on some, and that had kind of come out of speaking to the people who were running the trial. And then I actually got my hand on some parts of the report that were being circulated amongst that. You kind of mentioned before, but just to reintroduce them, this trial had a group of, they called it Stakeholder Advisory Board, essentially a group of experts from everywhere from tech companies themselves, from government, from civil society, who kind of were weighing in on how the trial was designed and was running. A snippet of the results was circulated to them, and then I got my hands on it, and I was able to confirm it with some people on the trial, so I knew it was legit. And it had showed, for example, that fewer than half of the companies that had been tested, which I actually think was 28, and by tested, when I did that asterisk before, I meant that within the trial, they said people were being tested, but that ranged from being like an interview, so being like, hello, I have a product and I think it is good, all the way up to actually having kids in the wild, or I mean in schools, in their wild environment, test it to see how it worked, to see false positives, false negatives. And they said, I think out of the 28 that had actually gone through actual, what I would call testing, which is having people use a product, less than half of them from memory were at a level of having a commercially viable product. So already, out of that 53, I think that then brings you to the fewer than 14 of them actually had things that people could even potentially use right now. And he gave us some kind of data on the accuracy. So we still don't exactly know what this trial has found. They did give us these findings saying we think that we can do it, but speaking to people involved in the trial, these experts who know this really well but aren't actually running it, they have grown, not all of them, but many of them have grown increasingly concerned while the trial's been running, that this trial was kind of, it front ran its own results. Like, rather than putting out this data and saying, and here's why we think that this is, but we think you can do this thing, it actually just said, we think you can do this thing, we'll prove it later on. And based on even what little data they had, they have started to be like, I'm not even sure necessarily that the actual testing results will support that kind of press release that you put out before. So there's a lot of uncertainty, but that will kind of be almost sorted soon, because when we see the report, then we can kind of have the whole context of what basis these people had to say that this technology is going to work in the Australian context.
Yeah. And to really, I guess, just make that timeline and that point clear, you're talking about, months ago, this trial project putting out a statement, kind of like a press release, I guess, saying it's looking good. We should be able to do all of this. You'll have the result. You'll have the full public report in the coming months. Some of that preliminary testing data and information being circulated with the Stakeholder Advisory Board, who have been intentionally brought together to sort of guide this project and contribute their expertise. And those people saying, hang on a second, what we're seeing here doesn't match the tone of the statement that you put out. It doesn't match the completeness of what we would expect to see based on the statement that you put out. And I could imagine that some of them are not particularly happy about being publicly associated with this project as it goes on, if that's the way it's being conducted. Like, are there kind of rumblings about some disquiet and some concern amongst those stakeholders?
Yes, and thank you for putting that in a much more straightforward way
Pleasure.
than I think that I did. I think I got to start. It's such a complicated timeline, but
It
yes,
is. There are so many overlapping opinions in this as well, and so many different perspectives, and the timeline, because it is so short, like we said, this is 12 months and we're already here. Things are really coming at speed, and it is hard to keep track of.
totally. And like also having these concurrent processes where you've got essentially, like, you've got people in the lab supposedly testing the technologies at the same time as you've got the boffins in Canberra figuring out more of the details of the law, and it's all happening, but also not that long before this all needs to come into effect. It's kind of almost like it's hard to keep across. But yes, so to the experts who have a pretty limited view of the data that now we all have, but even still, very little, have become worried about the process because essentially, like, I mean, in the first place, the fact that they are running this trial after having said that they are doing this policy, a cynical person could say, well, of course, then the people who are running the trial could they say anything else other than this works? Like,
Exactly. It's a bit asked about.
is it even politically viable to come out and now say we actually don't think it's possible? But I would say that the people running this trial are UK experts in this stuff, and they are very kind of technical. They actually do have like some like interests, that there is some crossover with like the lobby group for this technology as well, which makes it complicated. But they have, at least with the kind of start of this trial and the way it was set up, tried to be very transparent and open, being like, here are conflicts of interest, here's how we're designing the trial. All of that to try and give people, an understanding of the technology. And that was the point. The point was to be like, and I think a really cool thing, actually, like, I know it's a very nerdy thing to say, but it is, for me, cool to be like, there's this technology that people are going to use commercially, and everyone out there is saying my stuff rocks, and you can't, like, I'm great at this and you should buy our services. Because if you think about it, like, all these companies who are saying we can figure out your age, they are essentially competing to get contracts with social media companies and other people to do this for them. Because companies like Meta, which has Facebook, all the way down to like small companies, generally don't want to actually be responsible for checking IDs or other things like that. Like, they want experts to do that, so that's off their hands. That's a money making opportunity as well. So you've got this commercial interest. So the idea that the government would be like, there's a lot of essentially like hype, there's a lot of bullshit, let's put some good data out there. Cool. A nerd's dream. Thank you so much. The reason why the reporting, as you can probably tell, has made me feel so conflicted about it is because, while I think there has been very good parts of it, particularly the way it was set up, the way that it has continued has essentially made some people in the trial feel uncomfortable about it. Like, this idea that they're doing this trial and they come out with the conclusions, they say, we've ticked the box, we've done this, but they weren't actually, the results, the proof, the working isn't available yet, made people feel like this was a political box ticking situation. That they could say, we've like the way that politics works, you can say, believe us, we've already decided this. They get all the headlines because this was covered as, like, when the preliminary results came out, it was broadly covered. Australia says that they can do this, and then everyone kind of moves on. And then in several months, which is now close to now, when they actually have the results and people dig down and maybe they say, well, you need to be more qualified or yada, yada, yada. By that point, everyone else has already moved on. So that's kind of why people feel like, why it's been a bit like, the way that it has been handled made them lose a bit of faith in it as well. Since the information that I reported out from the trial has really essentially like gone to ground. It stopped giving data to this expert board. It stopped, even like the minutes of meetings, which used to be published on the website, are now no longer published, and the last ones that were suddenly had a lot less detail because I and other people, I guess, reported on them as well. All this to say is, like, they appear to be acting in a lot more like politically stage managed way. That is the opposite of what you should be doing. You should be saying, if we want to improve trust, the whole point is to make people trust in this process. Let's be really upfront, warts and all. Let's say what's good, what's bad. Let's people critique it, and that's made people lose their faith in it. The final thing that I would just like add to that is why this is just like so difficult to even talk about. Like, the why I'm not out there shouting from the rooftops being like, this is a broken process, is because the way the stage managing the rollout of this trial is actually fundamentally separate from how the trials run. Like, you could use the trial as a political tool in a really careful, concerted way that would be not necessarily in the best interest of like open discussion, but would be to convince the public of something. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the trial itself is not valid. And I have no reason to believe that this group of people who are running the trial, who were given the tender, which was like a $6.5 million contract, haven't done it in a really rigorous way to the best of their ability. I have no reason to believe that they haven't done that. It's just that everything that's around it is that the expectations that were set at the start being like, we're doing something that's almost like in the like ideal of open science, that we are advancing the public knowledge, really quickly fell by the wayside as soon as, one, it became like politically expedient, but two, they started to like get essentially some criticism and heat on the way that they were running it.
Yeah, you're right, because the results of the trial, if it is, and as you say, it seems like it is being run in a very genuine and robust way to come to conclusions about the different types of technology that can be used to check the age of users online. What are those measures available? How do they work? Which ones are more effective? What are our tolerances of I don't want to say inaccuracy, but how
Yeah,
how
that's
far
right.
left and
Yeah,
right
yeah.
of art can we go? Like, what do we need to know about all of this technology? Seems like it is being addressed by this trial, and like any sort of science experiment or like research study, whatever the answer is at the end of that is what it is, and that's additional knowledge that we will have. That's a good and useful thing for the further development of any sort of any technology or any solutions that wants to build upon that. But then the messaging of that to come out and preemptively say, oh, this is all great and it's working fantastically well, and we'll be with you in a minute, it'll be rolled out in a minute, is a separate beast, but is unfortunately impacting perhaps the public perception of what this trial is, what it's meant to achieve.
Yeah, and I don't think it's just optics. I have a political bugbear when like journalists sometimes talk about how, well, like the what someone did was fine, but it looked bad,
Mm.
as if like journalists are completely like independent observers who have no influence over this stuff. Like, no, the reporting that we do, the coverage that we give issues shapes how people think about it. If something looks bad but is good, you shouldn't be like, saying that's not a good look, but it's fine.
Yeah.
You should be out there covering that, being like, this is, I think, covering it as with its substance, and being like, if you're an opinion writer, being like, this is good, or if you're just a normal journalist, contextualizing it so people understand the importance, not just how it looks. But like, I do think that like the way that this has been handled speaks to the credibility of the people running it, and so perhaps it's pressure from the government, perhaps it's just a desire to, the fact that there's these tight timeframes in to test a very new technology with a lot of companies place them under pressure to kind of do this. I don't know, but it's been like, the thing is, again, it's not this isn't just me, playing like political, like sometimes political like reality TV, being like, this character good, this character bad.
Yeah.
The trial in its risk assessment or risk register said one of our main threats is the public not trusting us and our results. So they say we've got to do this properly, and this kind of stuff, I think, does not it doesn't lead people to trust what they're saying as much as if they maybe handled it a different way.
I mean, that public perception aspect is interesting for me, because the ban itself, like the concept of making it so that kids up to the age of 16 cannot access harmful social media platforms, is broadly politically popular with the
Hmm.
public. And now, as part of the government's sort of running of this trial, in June, I think it was, they commissioned a survey of like public opinion on a whole range of things relating to this, 4,000 people, and it found that 90% of the respondents supported the use of age assurance technology to make it so that kids can't get onto online platforms that they're not supposed to be onto. Again, kind of like the legislation, it was quite broad in its wording, but I guess it's just taking a test of, what the public appetite for something like this is. At the same time, 80% of those respondents said that they didn't actually know how a person's age would be checked online. So this is something where they support it in principle, they support it in general, but it's not that they don't support the specifics and the details of how that works, but they actually don't know anything about the specifics and the details about how that works. Again, the legislation is very, very vague. So Maybe that's by design. Maybe they just haven't had the opportunity to know anything about it yet. But in the piece that you wrote about this survey, you called it the cursed monkey paw problem, where people are, less enthusiastic about the thing that they asked for once they realize the reality of what that actually means, which in this case does mean that not just children, but everyone's age essentially does need to go through some sort of checking online, which is the primary privacy concern around all of this. In your opinion, do you think that the public sentiment will shift on this the closer we get to something rolling out in December and more of the details become clear? Or do you think that people are still happy to sort of say, I'm doing the right thing, I don't care, do what you need to do online?
I think you can look at the UK and what has happened there recently to understand likely what will happen. So in the UK, they had a similar but not the same policy where um, websites, app makers needed to start age checking for risky websites. And so that wasn't just social media, although some social media did have to do some, but also included, adult websites, gambling, etc., yada, yada, yada. The reaction was, so all these companies had to do it by, I think it was July 25th. There was a big outcry. A lot of people there was a lot of news cycles about people getting around it. There were petitions. There were people who were frustrated that they couldn't access things without having to scan their face or upload their ID. There were people pointing out things that were over moderated, and which I think is a big and maybe undercovered potential risk, which is the idea that in the race to protect in the company's attempts to protect themselves from being penalized, they put more than is necessary behind age gates, which means that in the UK's example, like subreddits that were about periods, things about Israel and Palestine were restricted to 18-year-olds. So all these things happened, and that was now a few weeks ago, and I think that more or less the attention to it has kind of died off. And when I wrote the piece calling this policy a monkey paw problem, it was based on what you were talking about. This idea that the policy is popular, the people have no idea about the execution and the details of, whether people will have to upload their passport, whether they will have their face scanned, or whether these companies will use, data that they haven't, and that freaks you out, would be less popular. I think that is still true to an extent, but I have two reasons to believe that actually there may not be a big, while there might be like a moment where there's a lot of attention to it, there might not necessarily be a sustained backlash after an initial reaction. The first one is because we know from the UK, even from some of these measures that companies already do now, like Facebook, for example, where they already do have some of these measures, these companies do have ways to figure out people's age without requiring them to do anything onerous or obtrusive. Particularly the big ones already have a shitload of data on you. And that data can be as simple as you've had a Gmail account for 13 years. You're probably not 16 years old. And so that means that your YouTube account, probably you don't need to put in your passport to let them know that you're 16 or older. So if you think about that, like the vast majority of Australians have enough data and enough information held by these companies that in many cases it won't actually be as intrusive as some of the more extreme imaginings of how this might be, which is, come December 10, everyone might just be like, passports please, or you can't post on Facebook. So there's that. So I think it might end up just being like, while there might not just be a moment for a lot of people. The second thing is, like, I went to go speak to parents who were broadly for this law. Some had been actively involved in pushing for it. Others were just random parents. And I just wanted to understand, what do you actually expect? Because the government's been promising this is going to fix, everything from, or it's going to help address kids spending too long online, kids being exposed to harmful content, kids being cyberbullied, all kinds of things. They've made all these promises to at least help. What on that day, December 10, what do you actually expect that it will do? What do you actually want to see that will then determine whether you think it's a success or a failure? And what I was surprised to see is, despite, many people knowing that these systems can be circumvented, like that's a big part of it. Like I said, in the UK, plenty of people figured out ways to, like, they scanned a picture of a character's face in a video game in these facial analysis programs, and the program was like, yep, you're 18 years old, so please go and use this social media platform or whatever. Despite knowing that there will be a lot of kids who get around this, despite knowing that these services aren't perfect, parents were just like, I'm just kind of happy for any help. Like, I don't need it to be perfect. I just want something because I feel so out of my depth. And I think that's like a really instructive, because I think there is definitely going to be blowback. I think that there is definitely going to be a lot of people just getting around it and making this policy look stupid. I think it is abundantly clear that this policy, if I'm being like yes, it's obviously supposed to help kids. I also think it's really addressed at parents who feel like they can't protect their kids online. They have an anxiety. And so this idea, so because that, it's almost like fundamentally detached from the success of the policy itself. All that they want is this idea that the government has done something, and that is kind of coming into effect. They may not want, the 100% solution. They almost are just happy with the gesture that something is happening.
I mean, I think I'd even maybe go a step further than you to say that it is primarily aimed at parents and not really intended to address the very big problems and challenges that being online and particularly exposed to algorithmically delivered content, the effects that that can have on developing young brains. To put it generously, I think that that was a secondary consideration for this legislation, but that's my view, not yours. That's my opinion I'm putting out there.
Well, I mean, more parents vote than kids, so there's that. And
But that
also,
doesn't mean that, we don't
yes,
legislate things
I
for
know,
children, of
I know,
course.
I know.
But you're right in that it is it's a political beast, a political solution, gesture, safety blanket, whatever we want to call it, for many things that it cannot really address, even if it was very technologically accurate and successful and perfectly implemented. It was never going to address all of the ills that have been raised by this technology and the influence that big tech companies are having on Australian society and global society. But yeah, I do think that the optics, to go back to what we were talking about before, the optics of saying like we're offering something to make parents feel like we see them and hear them and are helping them is an incredible trade-off to make for the potential privacy concerns that do sit around this legislation.
The area that I think that I am more critical of is that, look, maybe I'm too cynical as a tech journalist. I spent too long seeing how, look, most of us put a lot of information online. Let's be real. And sometimes I find it funny what gets a reaction from people and what doesn't. Like, for example, a lot of people are adverse to the idea of face scanning to guess their age. Um, I understand that, but I also think that there's probably a large proportion of them who have pictures of their face on Facebook publicly, or Instagram. So there's, like, we have these, I would say, sometimes funny and emotional attachments to things about privacy and stuff. Putting that to a side, like, the thing that I'm actually really concerned about is, because this whole debate has been about parents' fear, it's entirely been centered around this idea of what are the risks of social media and what can we do to mitigate that. And there has been almost no discussion about what are the benefits of social media. What do kids in particular get out of it? Part of the issue with how all this has been spoken about, and particularly criticism of people who are pushing the bill, is that, and the policy, is this idea that, like, there's this conception that social media bad, just like bad, and that, particularly if you think about it, comes from parents, I think, who, and I don't blame them, but are probably more worried about the downside, more worried about kids being radicalized, abused, all that kind of stuff, but don't actually, I think, understand, because they aren't their kids, they're from a different generation, that there are many benefits to the connection that you can get online. And so when I'm thinking about this policy now, I look at the UK, I see that this technology is very clearly possible to roll out at a national level, and hasn't been like the world's worst schmozzle. So for me, like, while we can continue to look at that, and I've been super interested in that, and I will continue to be interested in that when the test result come out. Now, I think as the final months, as we come up to the ban coming into effect, I really think that it is time to focus on what now can we understand will be the impact of this policy? And in particular, what are we going to lose out on because we are restricting kids online? Because this policy is two parts. It's the thing where it's like, okay, we need to enforce a minimum age. Like, at the moment, there is no legal requirement that social media companies do anything to enforce their minimum age. So that's now saying you got to do something. The second part is this idea that we're raising it from 13 to 16. Those years are obviously very important. Technology and social media has formed a really crucial part of how many young people communicate with each other. And I think while there are risks, research shows that there are benefits as well. And even if you think that the harms outweigh the benefits, there's still questions about, like, how do you mitigate the loss? What alternatives could we have in another world where we didn't ban social media, but did something so that we could try and maintain some of the harms to allow people to be connected without some of the downsides? Because social media, obviously a lot of people feel quite negatively towards, but a lot of people use it as well because there obviously is a utility, there's a benefit that I think is sometimes lost. And the kind of scenario that I keep coming back to is, like, everyone's thinking, when they think kids on social media, they think about their cousin sitting on, or, a niece or a nephew sitting on the couch loudly watching YouTube videos rather than going outside. And I get why you're like, go out there and, go on a footy field and get your head knocked in, or whatever, like Albo's been saying. The thing that I think about is maybe the more edge cases and the less obvious examples of people and teens who use social media to get some stuff that they can't get in real life. Like, a queer teen who lives in regional Australia who doesn't know anyone who's gay or queer and out in their community, and uses social media in a way to connect to people who can help them understand themselves, who can help them understand a culture that they want to be connected to in a way that they wouldn't have before. And so when you cut off this form of communication, yes, you're stopping kids from spending too long watching Mr. Beast on YouTube, but you're also cutting off what, for some people, and according to the government's own research by its e-safety commissioner, is a really important resource. And I just don't think that and no one has really, honestly, at a public level, given a shit about the good things that we are losing out, because everyone is so obsessed with the idea about there are just downsides that we have to address, and this is the only way that we can think to do it.
It's taking a completely like prohibition approach to something.
Totally.
Which maybe we did not explore other potential solutions, whether they are policy solutions or not, to manage this thing that is nuanced and complex. As you say, it has downsides, but it also has incredible advantages. It is also, I would argue, whether we like this or not, these digital platforms are now like deeply embedded into our productive society. That's not something that we can easily unpick and say, well, if you don't like it, just stay off these platforms, because they are so much a framework and the fabric of the world that we live in.
Totally. And I think, like, I've been talking about this in a way that almost seems hypothetical. This idea that, oh, what if we didn't and we did something else, and wouldn't it be a better world, yada, yada, yada. There is actually another path, even within the teen social media ban, that was not taken, that I think would have been a better policy outcome. There was, at various times, I reported that there was initially this thing called the exception framework. Don't need to understand the lingo, but essentially it was going to be like, if your social media company doesn't have these features, and you could be like, algorithmic timeline, it doesn't have push notifications that, they're worried are keeping kids up too late or whatever. Whatever you want, come up with a set of features that you think are damaging about social media apps, put that in the legislation, be like, if you don't have these features, you can be excluded. And what that would do is give these companies an incentive to actually offer Australian kids, and potentially adults as well, a different option. So rather than just being like, we are banning social media because we are taking this abstinence, approach to it, you would be like, we think social media is damaging at the moment, but we also think that there is a better way possible. Clearly, these companies aren't doing enough to get there by themselves. But what if we incentivize them to do it? What if we say that you can continue to have these, children as users if you do these things that we think makes a healthier online experience? That was taken out because of a deal between the Labor Party and the Liberal Party just before the bill was introduced into Parliament. This was actually planned to be there, and an insider who had a knowledge of the drafting process told me, like, taking that out took this bill from being like something that would encourage and maybe heavily guide the hands of social media companies to have a better option, made into something that's completely just like putative, saying that social media has been bad in the past, and therefore we have to get rid of it, like, no matter what. And then recently, in some documents that came out from inside the Department of Communications, no one's really talked about this, but like, we saw that the government actually, even until like July, so last month, supported a recommendation to bring something like this back in, where you could exclude low risk services. The department itself actually said we should do, but unfortunately now we don't have enough time. So the fact that they left it this long, it got initially taken out, then it got recommended to come back in. They've now said we can't do this. So this isn't a hypothetical. We've at various times been very close to this idea of, what if instead of just saying we banning social media, what if we're saying we, as the Australian government, who can essentially decide if these companies have access to kids to use their technology, we can set the terms. Why don't we use this instead of just punishing them, set the terms to see if we can create a better internet, a better option for them that can keep some of the benefits maybe and get rid of some of the downsides, and maybe even, those kinds of features, those better apps, that have come as a result of this process could even filter up to adults as well, so that we could all have a better online experiences.
I mean, some of those features also are not necessarily as fantastical as people might believe. I think with the Facebook Papers whistleblower expose from 2021 or around about that time, there was a lot in there about how algorithmic feeds amplify a lot of the worst harms of, what was then Facebook, but now certainly applies to most algorithmic platforms, and how making tweaks like returning to a chronological feed would significantly reduce those negative impacts. So it's things like that, which we already have a lot of information around, we know could be very protective for kids and adults. People on Instagram have been talking about the return to the chronological feed for years. Those things are out there, but they are now not a part of this discussion, not a part of these laws, and potentially lost to, sort of like the political will once this is brought into effect. Well, Cam, that is, I think we will leave it for now, but we will definitely have you back on to cut through when we have the next big update in this story, because it's certainly not done. There are still 4 months to go before December. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of news in this space in between now and then.
Pleasure cutting through with you.
If you're listening to us on a podcast app, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review Cut Through. And if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. It all helps Crikey grow and gets our independent journalism out to more people. That's all for now. We'll be back next week.